Hello there. All right, kids. And by kids, I mean other adults. Just telling Jack everything is a sort of okay. One more sip of water because you have to stay hydrated. Rory plays The Sims, sits down on story time mat. I love that. Okay, so if you're just joining us, I've spent some time with some technical difficulties that everyone has been kind enough to sit through. As you can see, I've got a green screen with no Sims on it because our capture device or something isn't working how it should be. So a funny thing, just going off on a tangent, the funny thing about lipstick is that it contains these like tiny itty bitty things, and it can happen in beeswax too, where it like coats the back of your throat. It's like voice actors' worst nightmare is lipstick. So I just had to wipe it off because I didn't think I'd be reading. If you just got here, I am going to be reading The Ranger's Apprentice, or Ranger's Apprentice. This is the first book, Ruins of Gorlan. This is one of my favorite book series. It has 12, I think, in the whole series. One of them is kind of like a disjointed bunch of stories. It's not necessarily linear of sorts. And the very last one is actually, actually there are two prequels, excuse me, which are maybe 12 and 13 even. Anyway, it's by John Flanagan, who actually lives not far from where I grew up, which is pretty cool. So he's an Australian author. And yeah, welcome to my Twitch. This is very exciting to be streaming on my own channel. You might I keep hearing this bang, and it's my dog hitting my door, like, let me in. How could you leave me out here? Yeah, it's really exciting to be on my own channel. I'm not partnered with Twitch, but I do have a tip cup, as you can see right here, and a donation goal, as you can see right here. And there's my Twitter account if you'd like to follow me on Twitter, if you don't already. And I'm going to be... yeah, and you can do that just by clicking underneath the stream itself. You'll see a busking hat, and you can just click that. So let me quickly change my stream title to Story Time. Oh, goodness, is nothing working in this room? Story Time. Delete. All right. Rangers. Oop. Apprentice. The Ruins of Gorlan. All right. English. Playing creative. Okie dokie. I'm going to update that so everyone knows what we are doing here. So, I have the other couple videos on... Jeez, are they on my channel or Jack's channel? I have the other couple videos online somewhere. But just to rehash... Will, who is the protagonist in this story, they're all 16... and that's when these... Oh, excuse me. Let me start from the very beginning. It's a medieval book, and these ward mates. It's a story about Will, who's an orphan. He was adopted by the Baron to be one of the ward mates in his castle, and it's Baron Harold. Anyway, we'll get to that. But Will, who's the protagonist, really wanted to be a soldier, or a knight, rather, but he didn't get selected for battle school because he's kind of short and stealthy as opposed to being, like, big and bulky. So his childhood bully, Horace, was actually selected for battle school, but he wasn't. And instead of, normally when someone isn't selected for an apprenticeship because his other ward mates got like a scholar, like sort of like a lawyer scholar, a diplomat, and a chef, and then the knight. And he really wanted to be a knight, but he didn't get that. But instead of, normally they're told like, well, you can be a farmer, or, you know, help out in the field some way, but he wasn't. They were like, I'll just give you my answer tomorrow. And so the ranger is like a kind of, like, he's sort of a man that people kind of are suspicious of. I think there's an animal in this room. Excuse me 1 second. I think I'm going crazy. I can hear a collar. I don't know if she's just outside, but I could have sworn I heard her. Oh, speaking of. There we go. Hey. My hair is a little bit green. That's fine. I forget where I was. Oh, the Rangers. So the Rangers are kind of like, they kind of are viewed as sort of almost magical, like sort of sorcerers, just because they blend in with nature and they're really good at being stealthy and kind of hiding, and they're never where anyone expects them to be. So, I mean, you can probably guess from the title of the book where this is heading, but shall we pick up from where we left off? I think so. Again, it's my little tippy cup. Feel free to contribute to that if you feel so entertained. Samantha says, Caiti, you're wearing very cool leggings. Thank you. I appreciate that. I keep looking at it thinking I'm going to take a sip. I have a different cup, my Coca-Cola cup. All right. Let's get started. I can't really hold it up, unfortunately. We'll see how this goes with me holding it. Kind of. I guess here is fine. I just really like this. All right. This is chapter 5 of Ranger's Apprentice, The Ruins of Gorlan. It was long after midnight. The flickering torches around the castle yard, already replaced once, had begun to burn low again. Will had watched patiently for hours, waiting for this moment, when the light was uncertain and the guards were yawning in the last hour of their shift. The day had been one of the worst he could remember. While his yearmates celebrated, enjoying their feast and then spending their time in light-hearted horseplay through the castle and the village, Will had slipped away to the silence of the forest, a kilometre or so from the castle walls. There, in the dim green coolness beneath the trees, he had spent the afternoon reflecting bitterly on the events of the choosing, nursing the deep pain of disappointment and wondering what the ranger's papers said. As the long day wore on, and the shadows began to lengthen in the open fields beside the forest, he came to a decision. I'm just going to pause for a second, just as a recap. The paper, what happened was Will, the Baron was going to tell Will, oh, well, you can't be a knight, so maybe you can just be a farmer, but the ranger slipped the Baron a piece of paper, and the Baron looked at it, and he was like, okay, well, we'll decide tomorrow. So that's why this is, I'm just going to scratch my nose on the other side. So that's where that curiosity is coming from. He had to know what was in the paper, and he had to know tonight. Once night fell, he made his way back to the castle, avoiding villagers and castle folk alike, and secreted himself in the branches of the fig tree again. On the way, he had slipped unnoticed into the kitchens and helped himself to bread, cheese, and apples. He munched moodily on these, barely tasting them, as the evening passed and the castle began to settle down for the night. He observed the movements of the guards, getting a feeling for their timing as they went on their regular rounds. In addition to the guard troop, there was a sergeant on duty at the doorway of the tower that led to Baron Arald's quarters. But he was overweight and sleepy, and there was little chance that he would pose a risk to Will. After all, he had no intentions of using the door or the stairway. Over the years, his insatiable curiosity and a penchant for going places where he wasn't supposed to had developed within him the skill of moving across seemingly open space without being seen. As the wind stirred the upper branches of the trees, they created moving patterns in the moonlight, patterns that now Will used to great effect. He instinctively matched his movement to the rhythm of the trees, blending easily into the pattern of the yard, becoming part of it, and so being concealed by it. In a way, the lack of obvious cover made his task a little easier. The fat sergeant didn't expect anyone to be moving across the open space of the yard. So, not expecting to see anyone, he failed to do so. Breathless, Will flattened himself against the rough stone of the tower wall. The sergeant was barely 5 meters away, and Will could hear his heavy breathing, but a small buttress in the wall hid him from the man's sight. He studied the wall in front of him, craning back to look up. The Baron's office window was a long way up and further round the tower. To reach it, he would have to climb up, then work his way across the face of the wall to a spot beyond the point where the sergeant stood guard, then up again to the window. He licked his lips nervously. Unlike the smooth inner walls of the tower, the huge blocks of the stone that comprised the tower's outer wall had large gaps between them. Climbing would be no problem. He'd have plenty of foot and handholds all the way up. In some places, the stone would have been worn smooth by the weather over the years, he knew, and he'd have to go carefully. But he'd climbed all other 3 towers at the same time in the past, and he expected no real difficulty with this one. Just going to take a sip. Pause for effect. But this time, if he were seen, he wouldn't be able to pass it off as a prank. He would be climbing in the middle of the night to a part of the castle where he had no right to be. After all, the Baron didn't post guards on this tower for the fun of it. People were supposed to stay away unless they had business here. He rubbed his hands together nervously. What could they do to him? He had already been passed over in the choosing. Nobody wanted him. He was condemned to a life in the fields already. What could be worse than that? But there was a nagging doubt in the back of his mind. He wasn't absolutely sure that he was condemned to that life. A faint spark of hope still remained. Perhaps the Baron would relent. Perhaps, if Will pleaded with him in the morning and explained about his father and how important it was for him to be accepted for battle school, there was a very faint chance that his wish would be granted. And then, once he was accepted, he could show how his eagerness and dedication would make him a worthy student, until his growing spurt happened. On the other hand, if he were caught in the next few minutes, not even that small chance would remain. He had no idea what they would do to him if he were caught, but he could be reasonably sure that it wouldn't involve being accepted into battle school. He hesitated, needing some slight extra push to get him where he was going. It was the fat green sergeant who provided it. Will heard the heavy intake of breath, the shuffling of the man's studded boots against the flagstones as he gathered his equipment together, and he realized that the sergeant was about to make one of his irregular circuits of his beat. Usually, this entailed going a few meters around the tower to either side of the doorway, then returning to his original position. It was more for the purpose of staying awake than anything else, but Will realized that it would bring them face to face within the next few seconds if he didn't do something. Quickly, easily, he began to swarm up the wall. He made the first 5 meters in a matter of seconds, spread out against the rough stone like a giant 4-legged spider. Then, hearing the heavy footsteps directly below him, he froze, clinging to the wall in case some slight noise might alert the sentry. In fact, it seemed that the sergeant had heard something. He paused directly below the point where Will clung, peering into the night, trying to see past the dappled, moving shadows cast by the moon and the swaying trees. But, as Will had thought the night before, people seldom look up. The sergeant, eventually satisfied that he had heard nothing significant, continued to march slowly round the corner. That was the chance Will needed. It also gave him the opportunity to move across the tower face, so that he was directly below the window he wanted. Hands and feet finding purchase easily, he moved almost as fast as a man could walk, all the time going higher and higher up the tower wall. At one point, he looked down, and that was a mistake. Despite his good head for heights, his vision swam slightly as he saw how far he'd come, and how far below him the hard flagstones of the castle yard were. The sergeant was coming back into view, a tiny figure when seen from this height. Will blinked the moment of vertigo away and continued to climb, perhaps a little more slowly and with a little more care than before. There was a heart-stopping moment when, stretching his right foot to a new foothold, his left boot slipped on the weather-rounded edge of the massive building blocks, and he was left clinging by his hands alone as he desperately scrabbled for a foothold. Then he recovered and kept moving. He felt a surge of relief as his hands finally closed over the stone window ledge, and he heaved himself up and into the room, swinging his legs over the sill and dropping lightly inside. The Baron's office was deserted, of course. The three-quarter moon streamed light in through the big window, and there, on the desk where the Baron had left it, was the single sheet of paper that held the answer to Will's future. Nervously, he glanced around the room. The Baron's huge, high-backed chair stood like a sentry behind the desk. The few other pieces of furniture loomed dark and motionless on one wall, and on one wall a portrait of one of the Baron's ancestors glared down at him accusingly. He shook off these fanciful thoughts and crossed quickly to the desk, his soft boots making no noise on the bare boards of the floor. The sheet of paper, bright white with the reflected moonlight, was within reach. Just look at it, read it and go, he told himself. That was all he had to do. He stretched out a hand for it, his fingers touched it, and a hand shot out of nowhere and seized him by the wrist. Will shouted aloud in fright. His heart leapt into his mouth, and he found himself looking up into the cold eyes of Holt the Ranger. Where had he come from? Will had been sure there'd been nobody else in the room, and there had been no sound of a door opening. Then he remembered how the Ranger could wrap himself in that strange, mottled green-grey cloak of his, and seem to melt into the background, blending with the shadows until he was invisible. Not that it mattered how Holt had done it. The real problem was that he had caught Will here in the Baron's office, and that meant the end to all of Will's hopes. "Thought you might try something like this," said the Ranger in a low voice. Will, his heart pounding from the shock of the last few moments, said nothing. He hung his head in shame and despair. "Do you have anything to say?" Holt asked him, and he shook his head, unwilling to look up and meet that dark, penetrating gaze. Holt's next words confirmed Will's worst fears. "Well, let's see what the Baron thinks about this." "Please, Holt, no." Then Will stopped. There was no excuse for what he had done, and the least he could do was face his punishment like a man, like a warrior, like his father, he thought. The Ranger studied him for a moment. Will thought he saw a brief flicker of recognition, then the eyes darkened once more. "What?" Holt said curtly. Will shook his head. "Nothing." The Ranger's grip was like iron around his wrist as he led Will out the door and onto the wide, curving staircase that led up to the Baron's living quarters. The sentries at the head of the stairs looked up in surprise at the sight of the grim-faced Ranger and the boy beside him. At a brief signal from Holt, they stood aside and opened the doors into the Baron's apartment. The room was brightly lit, and for a moment, Will looked around in confusion. He was sure he had seen the lights go out on this floor while he waited and watched in the tree. Then he saw the heavy drapes across the window and understood. In contrast to the Baron's sparsely furnished working quarters below, this room was a comfortable clutter of settees, footstools, carpets, tapestries, and armchairs. In one of these, Baron Arold sat, reading through a pile of reports. He looked up from the page he was holding as Holt entered with his captive. "So you were right," said the Baron, and Holt nodded. "Just as I said, my lord. came across the castle yard like a shadow, dodged the sentry as if he wasn't there, and came up the tower wall like a spider. The Baron set the report down on a side table and leaned forward. "He climbed the tower, you say?" he said, a trifle incredulously. "No rope, no ladder, my lord. Climbed it as easily as you get on your horse in the morning. Easier, in fact," Holt said, with just the ghost of a smile. The Baron frowned. He was a little overweight, and sometimes he needed help getting on his horse after a late night. He obviously wasn't amused by Holt's reminding him of the fact. "Well now," he said, looking sternly at Will, "this is a serious matter." Will said nothing. He wasn't sure if he should agree or disagree. Either course had its dangers. But he wished Holt hadn't put the Baron in a bad mood by referring to his weight. It certainly wouldn't make things any better for him. "So, what shall we do with you, young Will?" the Baron continued. He rose from his chair and began to pace. Will looked up at him, trying to gauge his mood. The strong, bearded face told him nothing. The Baron stopped his pacing and fingered his beard thoughtfully. "Tell me, young Will," he said, facing away from the miserable boy, "what would you do in my place? What would you do with a boy who broke into your office in the middle of the night and tried to steal an important document?" "I wasn't stealing, my lord!" The denial burst from Will before he could contain it. The Baron turned to him, one eyebrow raised in apparent disbelief. Will continued weakly, "I just wanted to see it, that's all." "Perhaps so," said the Baron, that eyebrow still raised. "But you haven't answered my question. What would you do in my place?" Will hung his head. He could plead for mercy. He could apologize. He could try to explain. But then he squared his shoulders and came to a decision. He had known the consequences of being caught, and he had chosen to take the risk. He had no right now to beg for forgiveness. "My lord," he said hesitantly, knowing that this was a decisive moment in his life. The Baron regarded him, still half turned from the window. "Yes," he said, and Will somehow found the resolve to go on. "My lord, I don't know what I'd do in your place. I do know there is no excuse for my actions, and I will accept whatever punishment you decide." As he spoke, he raised his face to look the Baron in the eye, and in doing so, he caught the Baron's quick glance to Holt. There was something in that glance he saw. Strangely, it was almost a look of approval or agreement. Then it was gone. "Any suggestions, Holt?" the Baron asked in a carefully neutral tone. Will looked at the Ranger now. His face was stern, as it always was. The grizzled grey beard and short hair made him seem even more disapproving, more ominous. "Perhaps we should show him the paper he was so keen to see, my lord," he said, producing the single sheet from inside his sleeve. The Baron allowed a smile to break through. "Not a bad idea," he said. "I suppose, in a way, it does spell out his punishment, doesn't it?" Will glanced from one man to the other. There was something going on here that he didn't understand. The Baron seemed to think that what he had just said was rather amusing. Holt, on the other hand, wasn't sharing the joke. "If you say so, my lord," he replied evenly. The Baron waved a hand at him impatiently. "Take a joke, Holt, take a joke." "Well, go on and show him the paper." The Ranger crossed the room and handed Will the sheet he had risked so much to see. His hand trembled as he took it. His punishment? But how had the Baron known he would deserve punishment before the actual event? He realized that the Baron was watching him expectantly. Holt, as ever, was an impassive statue. Will unfolded the sheet and read the words Holt had written there. "This boy, Will, has the potential to be trained as a ranger. I will accept him as my apprentice." Oh! The Ranger's apprentice! What? I'll probably do one more chapter, but I just thought maybe we could talk about it. And my chair keeps squeaking, and I'm sorry. How is everybody going? What is... Oh, did I not click update information? My bad. My bad, everybody. So, what do you guys think? Do you have any questions? Anything you want to ask? So here's the thing. I actually have an accent for all of these characters, but I got scared, so I didn't use it. Also, I wasn't prepared. This was what I just read was chapter 5, I think. And the other chapters I think I've done in 2 different videos. So 1 and 2, 3 and 4, and then this one will be 5 and 6. You should read for Audible. Thank you. Okay. I'm just gonna say Dark Sage. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. I feel like when I left, I had a lot more people, and when I started reading, and now I've come back, it's like, yeah, a lot of people just don't really want to listen to you read. So I'm grateful for you guys hanging around. Global Defense Force says, Will took a hard risk. I feel like I've been in his position before. Yeah, definitely. The background for it, him talking about his father, is that there was a war. What's the book that I'm reading now? What's it called? It's Morgorath is the kind of like leader of the rebellion. He's an evil dude. Something Creek Pass, 3-Step Pass. It was a war. I think it was 3-Step Pass. But anyway, there was a war. And basically the only thing that Will knows is that his father fought in the war, and that he's kind of like a child of an orphan. Just a middleman. Thank you. Good luck with it. I'm gonna go back. I'm gonna find what you said. Good luck with the braces and going back to school. You're the best. James, Missy, and thank you. That's super kind of you. Thank you, James. And thank you for your thank you card. Thank you for your thank you card. We'll just keep it going. We'll just keep writing thank you cards for the thank you card for the thank you cards. It'll be awesome. So Will was an orphan of the war, basically. And so he's developed this narrative in his head that his father was like a knight, and he wants to be kind of just like him. So that's why he wanted so desperately. And he kept saying, like, I might be little now, but I'm going to have a growing spurt, or a growth spurt. So that's kind of what his deal was. Excuse me. Southpaw says, I'm late to the party. What do you plan to study? I'm going to be doing plant biology eventually, once I get through my first kind of like 2 years of general just college courses. Yeah, so we should start a Twitch book club. That could be cool. We should do that. Just thinking about like doing Holt's accent. It's kind of like a weird Irish-Scottish blend, because he's from Hibernia, which is basically kind of like, I think from the map, it's kind of, let me see if they have a map in this one. I don't think they do have a map in the first one, in the first book. No. But I think it's Ireland. But I often get accents mixed up. She's gonna be better than Mark Watney. I don't know. That character could make potatoes out of poop, so who even knows? I'll try to do the accent, but if it takes you out of it, just let me know and I'll stop doing the accent. Dino Claw, what's up? Thank you guys for hanging out. Let's start the next chapter. We'll start this next one. All right. All right. I feel bad that I went a whole chapter without doing the accents. All right. Shall we? The Children's Book Council of Australia. Notable book. Yeah, the reason these covers, they don't make these covers anymore. I loved them because my mom's boyfriend once was like, hey, they need the ABC, which is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, needs like this chick to be on this cover of a book. And I was like, oh my God, I totally didn't even realize that you could be on the covers of books. And so I just like to think of this guy being like, someone was just like, hey, we need you to dress up in like medieval, like elf ranger kind of clothes and just pretend like you're going to shoot an arrow and we're going to put it on a book. Okay, thanks. So I like these covers a lot. They don't make them anymore. Hey, Strife. Someone explain the goals to me real quick. Caiti is going back to school? ? Yes. I am. It says school, teeth, and pimp alls. Going back to school to study plant biology, which is very exciting for me, but I haven't really pretty much this is the first time I've talked about it. And so I'm putting myself out there on Twitch so that I can hopefully busk some monies together and pay for class, basically. And also I have to get braces, so yay. Double yay. And at the moment I am reading Ranger's Apprentice, which is very exciting. So this is chapter 6. We just read chapter 5. Let's do it. That was me breathing out. Will stared at the words on the paper in utter confusion. His first reaction was one of relief. He wasn't going to be condemned to a lifetime of farm work, and he wasn't going to be punished for his actions in the Baron's study. Then that initial sense of relief gave way to a sudden nagging doubt. He knew nothing about rangers, beyond myth and superstition. He knew nothing about Holt, apart from the fact that the grim, grey-cloaked figure had made him feel nervous whenever he was around. Now it seemed he was being assigned to spend all his time with him, and he wasn't sure that he liked the idea at all. He looked up at the two men. The Baron, he could see, was smiling expectantly. Apparently, he felt that Will should greet this decision as good news. He couldn't see Holt's face clearly. The deep cowl of his cloak left his face in shadow. The Baron's smile faded slightly. He appeared a little puzzled by Will's reaction to the news, or rather, his lack of any visible reaction. "Well, what do you say, Will?" he asked in an encouraging tone. Will drew a deep breath. "Thank you, sir, my lord," he said uncertainly. What if the Baron's earlier joke about the note containing his punishment was more serious than he thought? Maybe being assigned to be Holt's apprentice was the worst punishment he could have chosen. But the Baron certainly didn't look as if he thought so. He seemed to be very pleased with the idea, and Will knew he wasn't an unkind man. The Baron gave a little sigh of pleasure as he lowered himself into an armchair. He looked up at the ranger and gestured towards the door. "Perhaps you might give us a few moments alone, Holt. I'd like to have a word with Will in private," he said. The ranger bowed gravely. Certainly, my lord," he said, the voice coming from deep inside the cowl. He moved silently as ever past Will and out through the door that led to the corridor outside. The door closed behind him with barely a sound, and Will shivered. The man was uncanny. "Sit down, Will." The Baron gestured to one of the low armchairs facing his own. Will sat nervously on the edge of it, as if poised for flight. The Baron noted his body language and sighed. "You don't seem very pleased with my decision," he said, sounding disappointed. The reaction puzzled Will. He would have thought a powerful figure like the Baron would care one way or another what an insignificant ward would think about his decisions. He didn't know how to answer, So he sat in silence until finally the Baron continued. "Would you prefer to work as a farmhand?" he asked. He couldn't believe that a lively, energetic boy like this could possibly prefer such a dull, uneventful life, but maybe he was wrong. Will hurriedly reassured him on that score. "No, sir," he added hastily. The Baron made a small questioning gesture with his hands. "Well then, would you prefer that I punished you somehow for what you've done?" Will started to speak, then realized that his answer might be insulting and stopped. The Baron gestured for him to continue. "It's just that I'm not sure you haven't, sir," he said. Then, noticing the frown that creased the Baron's forehead as he said the words, he hurried on. I don't know much about rangers, sir, and people say—" He let the words tail off. It was obvious that the Baron held Holt in some esteem, and Will didn't think it was polite for him to point out that ordinary people feared the ranger, and thought they were warlocks. He saw that the Baron was nodding, and a look of understanding had replaced the perplexed expression he had been wearing. "Of course. People say they're black magicians, don't they?" he agreed, and Will nodded, not even realizing he was doing so. "Tell me, Will, do you find Holt to be a frightening person?" "No, sir," Will said hastily. Then, as the Baron held his gaze, he reluctantly added, "Well, maybe a bit." The Baron leaned back, steepling his fingers together. Now that he understood the reasons for the boy's reluctance, he berated himself mentally for not foreseeing them. After all, he had a better knowledge of the Ranger Corps than he could expect of a young boy that just turned 15, who was subjected to the usual superstitious mutterings of castle staff. "The Rangers are a mysterious group of people," he said, "but there's nothing about them to be frightened of, unless you're an enemy of the kingdom." He could see that the boy was hanging on his every word, and he added jokingly, "You're not an enemy of the kingdom, are you, Will?" "No, sir," Will said in a sudden fright, and the Baron sighed again. He hated it when people didn't realize he was joking. Unfortunately, as overlord of the castle, his words were treated with great seriousness by most people. All right, he said reassuringly. "I know you're not. But believe me, I thought you'd be glad of this appointment. An adventurous lad like you should take life as a ranger like a duck to water. It's a big opportunity for you, Will." He paused, studying the boy closely, seeing that he was still uncertain about the whole matter. "Very few boys are chosen to be apprentice rangers, you know. The opportunity only comes up on rare occasions." Will nodded, but he still wasn't totally convinced. He thought he owed it to his dream to have one last attempt at battle school. After all, the Baron did seem to be in an uncommonly good mood this evening, in spite of the fact that Will had broken into his office. "I wanted to be a warrior, sir," he said tentatively, but the Baron shook his head immediately. "I'm afraid your talents lie in other directions. Holt knew that when he first saw you. That's why he asked for you." "Oh," said Will. There wasn't much else that he could say. He felt he should be reassured by all that the Baron had said, and to a certain degree he was, but there was still so much uncertainty to it all, he thought. "It's just that Holt seems to be so grim all the time," he said. "He certainly doesn't have my sparkling sense of humor," the Baron agreed. Then, as Will looked blankly at him, he muttered something under his breath. Will wasn't sure what he'd done to upset him, so he thought it best to change the subject. "But what does a ranger actually do, my lord?" he asked. Once again the Baron shook his head. "That's for Holt to tell you himself. They're a quirky group, and they don't quite like other people talking about them too much. Now, perhaps you should go back to your quarters and try to get some sleep. You're to report to Holt's cottage at 6 o'clock in the morning." "Yes, my lord," Will said, rising from his uncomfortable perch on the edge of the chair. He wasn't sure if he was going to enjoy life as a ranger's apprentice, but it appeared he had no choice in the matter. He bowed to the Baron, who nodded briefly in return, then he turned away for the door. The Baron's voice stopped him. "Will, This time, use the stairs. Yes, my lord, he replied seriously, and was a little puzzled by the way the Baron rolled his eyes to the sky and muttered to himself again. This time, Will could make out a few words. It was something about jokes, he thought. He let himself out through the door. The sentries were still on duty on the landing by the stairs, but Holt was gone, or at least he appeared to be. With the Ranger, you could never quite be certain. That was chapter 6. Yay! So, what are you thinking? What you doing? I should have just kept reading. That chapter seemed really short, but that's okay. I might read one more chapter and then we'll call it. So again, if you've just popped in, we're reading Ranger's Apprentice, The Ruins of Gorlan by John Flanagan. It's a medieval kind of story. It must be pretty good. You Cheeky Boy says, may I get a quick rundown? I've never read this series before. Sure. It's set in medieval time, in a fanciful, England, or rather Great Britain. And this is a story about Will, who is the Ranger's apprentice. And the Rangers are basically, if you've seen Lord of the Rings, they're pretty much like Aragorn, where they're kind of... They think they're almost like magicians, or not even like sorcerers, in the way that they're able to blend in, and they're spies because they can kind of hide in places that you wouldn't normally expect someone to hide, and they're just very, very good at sneaking, really, really good at sneaking and being kind of one with nature. And so Will is an orphan of the previous war that happened in the kingdom, and he really wanted to... Strife! Thank you so much. I can't read that. I need to figure that out. Where is my... So I can read what you said. Be cool, stay in school. Paying for my grad school myself, but I can skip movies this weekend and chip in. Oh, my goodness. That was a very, very, very thoughtful thing to do. Thank you, Strife. That's really lovely. 10.67% of the way there. What? That's crazy. Oh yeah. So Will is an orphan of the previous war that happened, and he really wants to be a knight because he knows, the only thing he knows about his father was that he fought in the war, but he doesn't know anything about like his rank or what he did. So he's created this narrative that his father was actually a knight. So he really wanted to go to battle school, but he's a really nimble, kind of small young boy. And he had convinced himself that he was going to have a growth spurt, and that he could go to battle school and start learning, and then he would eventually grow, but he wasn't chosen for battle school. So while his ward mates, the other orphans that he grew up with, while they were chosen to be scholars and diplomats and chefs and knights, Will wasn't given a task. He wasn't taken, no master of a craft chose him. But Holt, who's that fief's ranger, he left a note with the Baron, and the Baron was like, well, I won't send you to farm duties, I'll keep thinking about it. And so the chapter before the one I just read was Will, who decided he really wanted to read what that note said, so he climbed up the tower, and he basically did everything that rangers do, where he snuck in plain sight using the way that the trees move and the light, and he watched for patterns and saw that the sentry The sentries change shift every so often. So he basically took all this information and planned a route for himself and climbed up the tower and got into the office. But of course, Holt knew he was going to do that because Rangers are inherently curious. So he knew that he was going to do that, and waited for him in the office. And so that the chapter I just read was Will being caught by Holt, who's the ranger that he's going to be apprenticed to, and figuring out that that was kind of all a ploy to see what skills he had and to prove to the Baron, who is basically kind of like the adopted father of them all, that Will was should be a ranger. And so because the Rangers are regarded as kind of, not kind of like warlocky, it says in the book, Will is also very superstitious of them, very unsure about how they blend into things, and he thinks there might be something kind of magical about them. So he's like, I don't know if I really want to do this because this guy seems really grumpy, and I don't know, I still want to be a knight. So yeah, that was Will getting the information that he's going to be a ranger. Southpaw says, I wish I had some spare money so I could help you go back to school. Oh, well, thank you. Just being here is lovely. Thank you very much. Dark Sage, mystical. Yeah, they're kind of mystical. Yeah, they're like unicorns. Yeah, I think that's pretty much it. Oh, the preface to this is that the war that happened, that Will, the protagonist's father, died in, was started by a man named Morgarath, who was a baron who went evil, basically. The preface of this book was Morgarath coming back. So that was kind of literally the preface to it. And so that's what we're reading about now. About Will being a little kiddo. Little kid coming in and being an apprentice ranger. Oh yeah, so rangers are what do you call them? Archers. I was gonna say arrow guys. But they are expert archers. So so that's kind of the skill that he'll like. Whereas the knights are expert swordsmen, these guys are expert archers. So, does this have any parallels to Lord of the Rings, Global Defense Forces? Not really. It doesn't actually have any. It's funny. It doesn't have any mythical creatures in it aside from this book, basically. This book is pretty much the only one that they have any kind of borderline mythical kind of anything. And then other parallels. Not really. Yeah, it doesn't have elves or any like dwarves or anything. It's just kind of medieval Sword in the Stone kind of story. It's not Sword in the Stone, but you kind of imagine that era. There's no magic. It's very, yeah, I mean, I'm kind of not selling it very well, but it's a fun story. Yeah, I guess the only parallels would be Aragorn as the ranger, because that's very much like how these rangers kind of are. So I think I might read An Arborist is a specialist in treating damaged trees. Muscle Bear says, damn, no hippogriffs. Yeah, no hippogriffs, unfortunately. I still maintain that Newt Scamander is a hippogriff, but whatever. You heard it here first, folks. I think they're also casting for Newt Scamander's older brother, which is pretty cool. Okay, I'm just gonna go to... There we go. Oh, hello, computer. You've come back. Alright. So I think I'm going to read chapter 7, and then I'll probably call it a night. Morgoth reminds me a bit of Sauron. Yeah, he actually I mean, a little bit. You could argue that this particular story is kind of reminiscent of that, especially the the very last book that they've released, which is pretty much literally the book right before this, so it's come full circle. It's very interesting like that. But yeah, I would probably argue that this book is probably the most Lord of the Ringy kind of book, but yeah, it's not very mythical kind of. Yeah, crossbowman. Cool. We're just thinking of the archer and what you call people who are proficient with a bow and arrow. Awesome is what you call them. I wish my chair didn't squeak so much. I'm sorry about that. All right. I'm going to try to just give me a I need to get my like I need to roll my S's to be able to do this accent for Holt. I didn't mean to laugh before, but you know what? May as well just try it. All right. So this is chapter 7. I'm gonna move this back a little bit so I can lean into it. Okay. It felt strange to be leaving the castle after all these years. Will turned back at the bottom of the hill, his small bundle of belongings slung over his shoulder, and stared up at the massive walls. Castle Redmont dominated the landscape. Built on top of a small hill, it was massive. It was a massive three-sided structure, facing roughly west and with a tower at each of the 3 corners. In the center, protected by the 3 curtain walls, were the castle yard and the keep, a 4th tower that soared above the others and housed the Baron's official quarters and his private living apartments, along with those of his senior officers. The castle was built in ironstone, a rock that was almost indestructible, and in the low sun of early morning or late afternoon seemed to glow with an inner red light. It was this characteristic that gave the castle its name, Redmont, or Red Mountain. At the foot of the hill and on the other side of the Tarbis River lay Wensley Village, a cheerfully haphazard cluster of houses with an inn and those craft shops necessary to meet the demands of day-to-day country life. A cooper, wheelwright, smithy, and harness maker. The land around had been cleared for some distance, both to provide farmlands for the villagers to tend to and prevent enemies from being able to approach unseen. In times of danger, the villagers would drive their flocks against the wooden bridge that spanned the Tarbis, removing the center span behind them, and seek shelter behind the massive ironstone walls of the castle, protected by the Baron's soldiers and the knights trained in Redmont's battle school. Holt's cottage lay some distance away from both castle and village, nestling under the shelter of the trees at the edge of the forest. The sun was just rising over the trees as Will made his way to the log cabin. A thin spiral of smoke was rising from the chimney, so Will reasoned that Holt was already up and about. He stepped up onto the veranda that ran the length of one side of the house, hesitated for a moment, then, taking a deep breath, he knocked firmly on the door. "Come in," said a voice from inside. Will opened the door and went into the cottage. It was a small but surprisingly neat and comfortable looking inside. He found himself in the main room, a combined living and dining area with a small kitchen at one end, separated from the main area by a pine bench. There were comfortable chairs ranged around the fire, a well-scrubbed wooden table, and pots and pans that gleamed from much polishing. There was even a vase of brightly colored wildflowers on the mantel shelf, and in the early morning sun streamed cheerfully through a large window. 2 other rooms led off the main room. Holt sat in one of the chairs, his booted feet resting on the table. "At least you're on time," he said gruffly. "Have you had your breakfast yet?" "Yes, sir," said Will, staring in fascination at the ranger. This was the first time he had ever seen Holt without his grey-green cloak and hood. The ranger was wearing simple brown and grey woolen clothes and soft-looking leather boots. He was older than Will had realized. His hair and beard were short and dark, but peppered with steel-grey flecks. They were both roughly trimmed, and Will thought they looked as if Holt had cut them himself with his hunting knife. The ranger stood up. He was surprisingly small in build. That was something else Will had never realized. The grey cloak had concealed a lot about Holt. He was slim and not at all tall. In fact, he was considerably shorter than average height. But there was a sense of power and whipcord strength about him, so that his lack of height and bulk didn't make him any less daunting a figure. "Finished staring?" asked the ranger suddenly. Will jumped nervously. "Yes, sir. Sorry, sir," he said. Holt grunted. He pointed to one of the small rooms Will had noticed as he entered. "That'll be your room. You can put your things in there." He moved away to the wood stove in the kitchen area, and Will hesitantly entered the room he had indicated. It was small, but like the rest of the cottage, it was also clean and comfortable looking. A small bed lay alongside one wall. There was a wardrobe for clothes and a rough table with a washing basin and jug on it. There was also, Will noticed, another vase of freshly picked wildflowers, adding a bright spot of color to the room. He put his small bundle of clothes and belongings on the bed and went back into the main room. Holt was busy by the stove, his back to Will. Will coughed apologetically to attract his attention. Holt continued to stir coffee into a pot on the stove. Will coughed again. "Got a cold, boy?" asked the ranger without turning around. No, sir." "Then why are you coughing?" asked Holt, turning round to face him. Will hesitated. "Well, sir," he began uncertainly, "I just wanted to ask you, what does a ranger actually do?" "He doesn't ask pointless questions, boy," said Holt. "He keeps his eyes and ears open, and he looks and listens, and eventually, if he hasn't got too much cotton wool between his ears, he learns." "Oh," said Will. "I see." He didn't, and even though he realized that this was probably no time to ask more questions, he couldn't help himself, repeating, a little rebelliously, "I just wondered what rangers do, is all." Holt caught the tone in his voice and turned to him, a strange gleam in his eye. "Well then, I suppose I better tell you," he said. "What rangers do, or more correctly, what rangers' apprentices do, is the housework." Will had a sinking feeling as the suspicion struck him that he'd made a tactical error. "The housework?" he repeated. Holt nodded, looking distinctly pleased with himself. "That's right. Take a look around." He paused, gesturing around the interior of the cabin for Will to do as he suggested, then continued. "See any servants?" "No, sir," Will said slowly. "No, sir, indeed," Holt said, "because this isn't a mighty castle with a staff of servants. This is a lowly cabin, and it has water to be fetched, and firewood to be chopped, and floors to be swept, and rugs to be beaten. And who do you suppose might do all those things, boy?" Will tried to think of some answer other than the one which now seemed inevitable. Nothing came to mind, so he finally said in a defeated tone, "Would that be me, sir?" "I believe it would be," the ranger told him, then rattled off a list of instructions crisply. "Bucket there, barrel outside the door, water in the river, axe in the lean-to, firewood in the cabin, broom by the door, and I believe you can probably see where the floor might be." "Yes, sir," said Will, beginning to roll up his sleeves. He noticed the water barrel as he approached, obviously holding the day's water supply for the cabin. He estimated that it would hold 20 or 30 buckets full. With a sigh, he realized he was going to have a busy morning. As he walked outside, the empty bucket in one hand, he heard the ranger say contentedly as he poured himself a mug of coffee and sat down again, "I'd forgotten how much fun having an apprentice can be." Will couldn't believe that such a small and seemingly neat cottage could generate so much cleaning and general maintenance. After he had filled the water barrel with fresh river water, 31 buckets full, he chopped wood from a stack of logs behind the cabin, piling the split firewood into a neat stack. He swept out the cabin. Then, after Holt decided that the rug on the living room floor needed beating, he rolled it up, carried it outside, and draped it over a rope slung between two trees, beating it savagely so that clouds of dust flew from it. From time to time, Holt leaned out the window to give him encouragement, which usually consisted of curt comments such as, "You've missed a bit on the left side," or "Put some energy into it, boy." When the rug had been replaced on the floor, Holt decided that several of his cooking pots didn't gleam with sufficient intensity. "We'll have to give them a bit of scouring," he said, more or less to himself. Will knew by now that this translated to, "You'll have to give them a bit of scouring." So, without a word, he took the pots to the river's edge and half filled them with water and fine sand, scouring and polishing the metal until it gleamed. Holt, meanwhile, had moved to a canvas chair on the veranda, where he sat reading through a tall pile of what looked to be official communications. Passing by once or twice, Will noticed that several of the papers bore crests and coat of arms, while the vast majority were headed with a simple oak leaf design. When Will returned from the riverbank, he held the pots up for Holt's inspection. The ranger grimaced at his distorted reflection in the bright copper surface. Not bad. Not bad. Can see my own face in it," he said, then added without a hint of a smile, "Maybe not such a good thing." Will said nothing. With anyone else, he might have suspected it was a joke, but with Holt, you simply couldn't tell. Holt studied him for a second or two, then his shoulders lifted slightly in a shrug, and he gestured for Will to return the pots to the kitchen. Will was halfway through the door when he heard Holt behind him say, "That's odd." Thinking the ranger might be talking to him, Will paused at the door. "I beg your pardon?" he said suspiciously. Each time Holt had found a new chore for him to attend to, he had seemed to begin the instruction with a statement like, "How unusual. The living room floor is full of dust," or, "I do believe the stove is in dire need of a supply of firewood." It was an affectation that Will had found more than a little annoying over the day, although Holt seemed to be quite fond of it. This time, however, it seemed that he had been genuinely musing to himself as he read through a new report, one of the oak leaf crested ones, Will noted. Now the ranger looked up, a little surprised that Will had addressed him. "What's that?" he said. Will shrugged. "Sorry. When you said that's odd, I thought you were talking to me." Holt shook his head several times, still frowning at the report in his hand. No, he said, a trifle distractedly. "I was just reading this." His voice trailed away at the frown, and he frowned thoughtfully. Will, his curiosity roused, waited expectantly. "What is it?" he ventured finally to ask. As the ranger turned those dark eyes on him, he instantly wished he hadn't. Holt regarded him for a second or two. "Curious, aren't you?" he said at length, and when Will nodded uncomfortably, he went on in an unexpectedly milder tone. "Well, I suppose that's a good trait for a ranger's apprentice. After all, that's why we tested you with that paper in the Baron's office." "You tested me?" Will set the heavy copper kettle down by the door. "You expected me to try to see what it said?" Holt nodded. "Would have been disappointed if you hadn't. Also, I wanted to see how you go about it." Then he held up a hand to forestall the torrent of questions that were about to tumble out of Will's mouth. "We'll discuss that later," he said, glancing meaningfully at the kettle and the other pots. Will stooped to retrieve them and turned back to the house once more, but curiosity still burned in him, and he turned to the ranger again. "So, what does it say?" he asked, nodding towards the report. Again there was a silence as Holt regarded him, perhaps assessing him. Then he said, "Lord Northolt is dead. Apparently killed by a bear last week while out hunting." "Lord Northolt?" Will asked. The name was vaguely familiar to him, but he couldn't place it. "Former Supreme Commander of the King's Army," Holt told him, and Will nodded as if he had known this. But since Holt seemed to be answering his questions, he was emboldened to continue. "So, what's odd about it? After all, bears do kill people from time to time." Holt nodded. "True, but I would have thought Cormdon Fief was a little far west for bears, and I would have thought Northolt was too experienced a hunter to go after one alone." He shrugged, as if dismissing the thought. "But then again, life is full of surprises, and people do make mistakes." He gestured towards the kitchen again, indicating that the conversation was over. "When you've put those away, you might like to clean out the fireplace,"
he said. Will moved to do as he was told, but a few minutes later, as he walked past one of the windows to the large fireplace that took up most of one wall in the living room, he glanced out to see the ranger tapping the report thoughtfully on his chin, his thoughts obviously a long way away.
And that was it. I have no idea what accent that was. I'm like, I can get away with that a little bit because he's from the fictional country of Hibernia, which you think is Ireland, but it could be like a because the actual island itself isn't shaped like England or like Great Britain, but they have the Scots at the north. The what do they call them? The Scotties, I think they call them. And then they have the Hibernians on the on the west. So it could be Wales or Ireland. So I'm hoping that I can get away with that. Definitely a city accent. My problem is getting my R's right. Strife says, the story is great. I could listen to Caiti's voice all night. Can we do this again soon, please? Well, this is actually the series that I really wanted to read out loud. So yeah, I could totally see us doing that again pretty soon. I mean, I want to do it on a regular basis. Let me look up a background for this. Let's see if I can't find a high-res background for the computer. What size is this? View image. Okay. Save this one as Ranger's Apprentice. And then if I do this, wait for it, wait for it, wait for it. Wait for it. And now I just have to do this. And do this. And then, what's that right there? Oh, it's not punched in enough. That's fine. Can I move it? Oh dear. Boom. What? There it is. That's pretty cool. Let me go back to here. Yay. Dark Sage says, City Irish and Welsh are similar, at least from what I've seen of BBC programming. I love that. Yay. Okay, well, I think that's a good place to land. I can probably... well, tomorrow is Warden Wednesday, so I'll be back for that. Hopefully playing a game, but if not... I don't know. I'll see what I can do. I might have to just use my computer, which is a little different, but that is no problem whatsoever. But yeah, thank you guys so much for hanging out. Muscle Bear says, please finish the book on stream. It's really relaxing. Oh, that's awesome. Well, thank you for saying that. I appreciate that. Yeah, I definitely will keep reading that. I think now that I'm feeling a bit better, I kind of went through a little bit of a bout. I'm feeling a bit better now, which is good. But yes, feel free. Thank you guys so much for watching. Feel free to follow me on Twitter. It's at @KaitieWard_. You can come back and watch on Twitch. Some of you are here now, which is awesome. Some of you, all of you, which is just twitch.tv/KaitieWard, and my YouTube, which is youtube.com
either, it's youtube.com/Caiti reads. So hopefully I will see you next time. Thank you so much for all of your tips. Thank you for being so awesome and for dealing with these technical difficulties. And I will see you guys next time. Be good to each other. Be good to yourself, and be good to the planet. See you next time. Bye.